It is my pleasure to welcome you to our event, American Liberalism Viewed from Abroad, a conversation among Aysuda Kölemen, Esther Solano, Kristen Zurich, Boris Vormann, and Claudia Wiesner. I would like to start this by thanking them for agreeing to participate in this timely conversation. And I especially want to thank Boris for putting this together. Thank you so much, Boris. We really appreciate it. I would also like to thank my colleagues, especially Sarah Girna, and also our project assistant Adriana Diaz and our intern Nicole Hohmann for their work on preparing this event. Thanks also go to the DAAD, the German Academic Exchange Service, for their continued support for our academically inclined programming. And of course, thanks also always goes to you, our audience, for making time in these turbulent times to join us for our Zoom events. I wish we could do or resume in-person events, but that will still take a while. And in the meantime, this gives us a chance to reach people in other places of the world and make them familiar with the work of Deutsches Haus. Now, before I introduce the event some more and introduce the speakers, I just want to mention a few upcoming events at Deutsches Haus. Next week, we'll have an event, Sovereignty Inc. 3 Inquiries in Politics and Enjoyment, which will be moderated by Elisabeth Bonfin. That's, I think, on November 5th. And then in November, we'll have an event with the Swiss writer Jonas Lucia in conversation with Tess Lewis, his translator, which will be moderated by Uli Baer. And we'll also have a conversation celebrating the 100th anniversary of Paul Celan's birth, a conversation between Pierre Joly and Paul Auster. And also, and this is the last event I'll mention, thanks for listening in on the shameless self-promotion. The last event that I want to mention is a conversation with Cornelia Funke, the best-selling German author. And I can't remember any of these dates, so you'll have to look them up on our website. In any case, shifting gears. So what are we talking about today? And I feel it's very timely, which I already mentioned, because of course this, not of course, but this is the last public event Deutsches Haus will be presenting prior to the elections, which, as we all know, will happen next week in 6 days or so. So if you haven't voted yet and you're eligible to vote, please do so, or encourage everybody you know who's eligible to vote. Please encourage them to vote. And I know that you might have to wait a long time. People have reported many hours of wait time in the current early voting, but please try to vote. That's the end of this. And now, Donald Trump's politics echo similar illiberal tendencies that rework state institutions and national imaginaries across the planet. How can we make sense of his 4 years in office? How does his administration compare to that of illiberal variants in Japan, Turkey, Brazil, and the EU? Today, experts on these topics will explore the specificities of and parallels between the cases in the above-mentioned countries and will seek to put the US experience into perspective. The panelists are all contributors to the recently published book, The Emergence of Illiberalism, Understanding a Global Phenomenon, whose co-editor, Boris Vormann, will moderate the event. And now I will introduce our panelists in a bit more detail. Aysuda Kölemen is a research fellow at Bard College Berlin. Her current research interests include autocratization and discourses on gender and family policies in Turkey. She has previously worked on the differences in public discourses on the welfare state in Europe and the US and the political dimensions of new religiosities in Turkey. Esther Solano is professor of, oopsie, I missed something here, is professor of social science at Federal University of Sao Paulo and teaches in the master program on Latin America and the European Union at University of Alcalá in Spain. Among other publications she has recently edited, Is There a Way Out? Critical essays on Brazil, Hate as Politics, and most recently, Brazil in Collapse. Moving on to Kristen Zurich. She joined the London School of Economics in 2020 from SOAS, University of London, where she was a senior lecturer of Japanese politics. Her research on international migration, nationalism, and political sociology has been translated into a half-dozen languages. She is the author of Making Tea, Making Japan, Cultural Nationalism in Practice, which received the Book of the Year award from the American Sociological Association's Asian section. Boris Vormann, our moderator, is professor of politics and director of the politics section at Bard College Berlin. His research focuses on the role of the state in globalization and urbanization processes, nations and nationalism, and the crisis of democracy. His most recent books are Democracy in Crisis, The Neoliberal Roots of Popular Unrest, with Christian Lammert, and Contours of the Illiberal State. I should mention that Boris Vormann is a former DAAD visiting scholar at Deutsches Haus, and so is Claudia Wiesner, whom I will introduce now. Claudia Wiesner is Jean Monnet Chair and Professor for Political Science at Fulda University of Applied Sciences and Principal Investigator of the Jean Monnet Network Debating Europe. Her main research interests lie in the comparative study of democracy, political culture, and political sociology in the EU multi-level system. Her most recent monograph is Inventing the EU as a Democratic Polity, Concepts, Actors, and Controversies. All right, thanks for bearing with me reading through these little bio blurbs. And now it's my great pleasure to hand things over to Boris. Boris, take it away. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here.
Thank you so much, Juliane. Thank you so much, Sarah, and also Nicole for organizing this event, which, I mean, the Deutsches Haus is a great institution, and these are very supportive people. And so I'm really thankful for us to have this panel here. And it is, I think I agree with Juliane, it is a very timely occasion. I'm happy for all of you to tune in and to have all the contributors to our volume. Speaking of shameless promotion, obviously this is about a book that just came out, but it's more than that. It's not just a book launch. Obviously, we're trying to think about the US predicament, not so much from the way we've gotten used to by looking at mail-in ballots and the closing statements of those different presidential candidates and the different scandals and spectacles, but rather we're zooming out and we're trying to tap into the knowledge and expertise of these four outstanding scholars and their knowledge of the different country cases and the comparisons that we can draw between the US and these other cases. Maybe just before we get started with the panel, one thing that I wanted to say is that perhaps one of the reasons, besides being a timely issue, that you tuned in is that obviously the title itself, American Illiberalism Viewed from Abroad, is a provocation. And I think it's more than a provocation, it's actually a three-pronged provocation. And I think teasing out how that is the case helps maybe create a backdrop for the discussions we'll have later on. I think one provocation is obviously the idea that something like illiberalism exists. And this is the hypothesis that we use in the book that goes through all the chapters, through all the theoretical chapters. In the beginning, we have center-left and center-right authors contributing. So we have a pretty interesting spectrum of thinkers on the theories of illiberalism. But we also have many cases beyond just the transatlantic context that are looking at this particular phenomenon. And so that first provocation is, well, illiberalism is a thing, right? And I think I just want to make two very short points about this. The first thing is that what we're witnessing is a something that's coming out of liberalism itself. It's out of the tensions of liberal democracy that we see these different things happening at the same time in different global contexts. And this is something that we call in the introduction the Neoliberal Implosion. I think that's the reason why we're seeing all these things in the different contexts, but it makes sense to think about them in comparison and individually in order to think about possible ways ahead. But that's only one part of the story. I think this kind of reaction to the failures of liberal democracy and disappointments and frustrations with liberal democracy is one important aspect. The other one is that what we're seeing now, and that's why we call it illiberalism rather than illiberal democracy or some other kind of label or populism, is because there's a productive generative tendency within illiberalism itself. And so what many of the authors in the book argue is that illiberalism, once a so-called populist is in office, captures the state, redoes the state, rethinks the national imaginaries, rethinks the nation and the demos, oftentimes in very narrow, ethnically minded ways. So this is a pattern I think that we'll hear about again in the different responses. That's provocation number one. The second provocation is obviously that there is such a thing as American illiberalism. The US is supposed to stand fully in the liberal tradition. This is, of course, the term that Louis Hartz coined in the 1950s. It's an older idea. The idea that the US, because of its specific exceptional development, was somehow, because it didn't have a feudal history, was beyond class struggle, was beyond all the other ideological tendencies and real practical fights. And so the idea that the US in its entirety, the entire political spectrum was liberal. It might be more libertarian, it might be more progressive, but overall it's liberal. And so stating that there is such a thing as American liberalism or illiberalism seems to be something that goes beyond that tradition. And the third provocation is that somehow looking at other contexts, other countries will help us in understanding the American tradition. American exceptionalism has it that the US has a very specific historical trajectory, a unique one, even sometimes a superior one. This is what many people have argued in the history. And so I think what we're doing here is to try and engage with those other national contexts to see to which extent we might actually be able to learn from other places, and to put the US in perspective. And that's what we're setting out to do. So the first question that I really would like to ask the panelists, and would like to start with Aysuda on the Turkish context and Erdogan, is where you see parallels between the US context and the Turkish context, the way that the president behaves, perhaps the ideological patterns, changes in civil society, in the state, etc.
Hi, thank you. So I want to start with this one thing that when I announced that, I would be presenting on this, and prior to that too, whenever we talk about Trump, Turkish people talk about the similarities between Trump and Erdogan, and sometimes they're so surprised by Trump's certain rhetoric and moves because they ask whether they're in touch, whether they're learning from each other, following Erdogan, with a little lag, of course, but doing very similar things. So this is a topic of conversation in Turkey, the resemblance between Trump and Erdogan, especially in the leftist circles, obviously. But from the right of Turkey, from the supporters of Erdogan, they also are more likely to be supporters of Trump and see him as a sympathetic figure as opposed to the left. So how are they similar? One thing is very typical of populism. They both harness resentment, and this resentment is based on collective victimhood of what they deem to be the nation, the people. And that's a very obscure term, which in Turkey changes from time to time, depending on the goals of the day. But it is in the last 5 to 6 years, Erdogan has started calling, instead of the nation, he says the native and the national elements. That's what he calls it, the native and the nationals. So this is, again, an obscure term. What does native mean? What does national mean? But it is very exclusionary, that's for sure, ethnically exclusionary, religiously exclusionary. But to feed this resentment, you have to have another. And who is the other? That's something like the 2 minutes. It changes from year to year, sometimes from week to week, but there are some common elements. They're the elites. And Erdogan harnessed this resentment, directed this resentment against the Republican elites for a very long time. The first decade that he was in power was mostly that. Second, minorities. Erdogan didn't use the entire minority rhetoric against ethnic minorities, but against religious minorities. But even in that, he didn't do that very much until after he started losing popular support and he started losing in the elections, and he could not get Kurdish votes anymore. And suddenly his definition of the nation and native became very ethnic and started excluding Kurds. And that happened in just a matter of months in 2015. The third thing outside the elites and the minorities is foreign powers, and that's a very useful thing. It's a very unilateral way of looking at the world, not international, not seeing the international environment as a place where there would be a lot of collaboration, but whenever something doesn't go the way that the Turkish government wants, picking fights and using those fights as ways to, again, garner support, to create a rally around the flag effect inside, domestically. And usually you need collaboration from the opposition parties, and it's very useful because very few opposition members can actually oppose this line of foreign power effect. Because they feel that they have to stand by the government in any kind of conflict with foreign powers. So what they do is taking this anti-elite rhetoric. What Erdogan did, again, very similar to Trump, is to undo traditional liberal democratic institutions. And how do they do this? What I find similar is that they first question the legitimacy of these institutions and then they start attacking them. First rhetorical attacks, and then it turns into real attacks on the institutions. So let me give you examples of three institutions that they've attacked similarly. The media. It has been the main target of the Erdogan regime from the beginning. First, yes, he started questioning the media from day one as part of the elites. And then he started using all the governmental powers like tax audits. He actually had his cronies buy mainstream media outlets. But that was not enough. So he had journalists fired, arrested, jailed. Now, you don't see this pattern with Trump in the United States. The system in the United States does not allow that, obviously. But you do see the questioning and the attempts to delegitimize the media. And interestingly, well, I can talk about that later about the differences. But and then when that was not enough, Erdogan turned to the internet and started censoring and controlling internet and alternative media sources. And I'm wondering if this is the next horizon for Trump. The second example I'm going to give is the judiciary. The courts were attacked as elite institutions, as bureaucrats that stand in the way of the people, who are always represented by Erdogan or Trump in this case. Therefore, when the courts stand in the way, they are illegitimate, and there should be a way to get around it. One way to get around it was to pack the courts with judges that were very loyal to the partisan cause. And in Turkey, that meant that getting rid of people with more merits and less partisan roots through various court packing measures. And in the end, in Turkey, it came to a point where judges were dismissed from civic duty, investigations started, and the whole judicial system was actually turned upside down through various measures over a decade. So the third example I'm going to give is academia, and you see this pattern, I think, in many populist governments. They start attacking academia. First, against the idea of academia, that it's an elite institution and that it does not represent the politics and the interests of the people. And Particularly, they target humanities and social sciences, because engineers are not the ones who are going to oppose authoritarianism. And then with time, that focus really zones in on certain things, because most right-wing and authoritarian and populist regimes are based on identity politics and politics of resentment. Any kind of, like, we saw Trump obsessing over Zin. And in a similar way, in Turkey, politicians Erdogan targets gender studies, historians, political scientists. But of course, it's not just a rhetorical thing, both in the United States and in Turkey, through funding mechanisms or legal measures or other mechanisms. And these mechanisms are very strong control measures over the economy in Turkey. But in the United States, it's not that strong at all. So more economic measures can be used in the long term, like not funding humanities and leading to closures of humanities departments is a political move, for example, if you look at it from a comparative perspective, because this is done throughout the world, because it is a locus of opposition to authoritarianism. So those three examples, and in Turkey, you see the extreme version of it, just like the judiciary and the media. The extreme version, in the end, academics were dismissed from civil service, they were arrested, they were sent to prison. So this is kind of the last step. And I think my 5 minutes are over. Is it? Yeah.
Thanks so much, Aysuda. So I think for everyone who is somehow aware of the American context, I mean, many of these things sounded very uncanny and similar. And some of the patterns that we, I think, will recognize across these different cases. Mostly this idea of one nation and a very narrowly defined nation, and the direct link between the nation and the leader. But let's move on, and let's switch continents really, and let's hear about the Brazilian case, Esther, if you like.
Well, thank you, Boris. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here with you to share my knowledge about Bolsonaro. And well, in a very similar case with Turkey, many say that Bolsonaro would be the tropical Trump, no? With this idea that Bolsonaro would be the Latin American Trump. I have some disagreements, but it's true that we have many similarities. And I'm going to point out here 2 or 3 very important similarities. The first one is that for both of them, the enemy is a central figure of their politics, the central concept. So Bolsonaro and Trump, for them, they don't have really opponents in politics. What they have is enemies. And the enemies, by definition, by nature, they must be treated in a war logic. So enemies must disappear in a physical way, or disappear in a metaphorical way. And if we understand democracy as the possibility of a coexistence of differences, Bolsonaro and Trump are deeply anti-democratic, because they understand democracy not as a politic way out of this coexistence, but as a war against this enemy. In the case of Brazil, for example, I think all of you know, the main public enemy, the public enemy number 1 is the Workers' Party, and Lula, of course. Just to give you an example of this enemy treatment, during 2018 campaign, Bolsonaro said in public that the Workers' Party supporters, they should all be machine gunned, they should all be killed. So I share a lot of things with the Turkey case. Both of them, they have a very narrow vision of the country, of the nation. So a country mainly thought for white middle class people. This is the idea of us against them. This mainly idea of the enemy. And among similarities, they both share a hate speech against democracy, of course, against other institutions like political parties. So very strong hate speech against the Congress, for example, in Bolsonaro case, against free press, of course. So free press is one of the public enemy too. Against Supreme Court, the Supreme Court for Bolsonaro, it became one of the most important enemies of the moment. Against universities, science, art, social movements. Brazil, for example, has some of the most scary war records on killing activists, for example. And of course, this very important hate speech against the so-called political correctness, against minorities, especially feminists. So a very important important anti-feminist speeches against LGBT people, against Black people. Of course, what I'm going to say about the US case, you all know very well with these racist, anti-feminist, and anti-LGBT speeches are all about. So what they do is what my colleague said before. They transform the feeling of resentment, fear, loneliness in hate, and they are very expert in doing that. But the problem of it all for me is that this hate speech, their supporters, the voters from Trump, Bolsonaro, they don't interpret this hate speech as hate. They interpret this hate speech as truthfulness, as authenticity, as freedom against a corrupt elite and tyrannical system. They interpret this hate speech as a very positive masculine way to act. So this hate speech is a really free way to behave and something very positive from a president. So what we have is a huge trivialization of hate speech. Me, for example, I do interviews with supporters of Bolsonaro, and I remember, for example, some of interviews with teenagers, with poor Black teenagers. And all you know that Bolsonaro has a very brutal hate speech against Black people, racist hate speech. And in many of my interviews, these Black teenagers, they said, well, Bolsonaro is not a racist man. He's very funny. He's very cool. He's amusing. So we like Bolsonaro. He's very cool. We really like him. So this hate speech, this brutality is interpreted as something funny and amusing. Young people in Brazil, they call Bolsonaro as a myth, something funny and something cool. So my question here, an existential question, is how can we fight this hate speech when this is not even interpreted as hate speech by their own victims? These voters from Bolsonaro, when I make these interviews, for example, one of the word most told me in the interviews was the word hope. I vote for Bolsonaro because he gives hope for me. So what we really have is that this hate and anti-democratic speech is transformed in hope. So how can we fight this hope that is really this hate that is being interpreted as hope? That is very difficult, really, for us.
I think Esther raised a very important point, which I think is also true for Trump, and that I might have emphasized a little bit more in the beginning, which is obviously it would require another panel to think about all the preconditions that made Trump possible, right? So the first two cases that we've heard of is about so-called populists or proto-autocrats in power, once they are in power. There is, of course, a critique of liberal democracy or liberalism or a part of liberalism that needs to be taken seriously, and that can help explain why these figures do come to power. But maybe this is something we can pick up again also in the Q&A. Thank you so much, Esther, and I'm looking forward to hearing the Japanese case, Kristin.
Perfect, thanks very much. I'll start off by giving a bit of contextualization, in part because Shinzo Abe, who was prime minister for the past 7 years, last month stepped down due to health issues. So I'll be talking mainly about Abe, but the current prime minister, Yoshihide Suga, is also really important to understand in order to understand Abe, and there'll be quite a lot of continuity in between the two prime ministers, I think. So in part because Suga was effectively Abe's pit bull. He had this position of chief cabinet secretary, so he was in charge of kind of press conferences in the media, as well as dealing with a lot of policy issues for Abe. So this is the background that the new regime in Japan is moving into for now. Of course, Abe is probably most famous internationally for Abenomics. And this, interestingly, in thinking about what the US can learn from Japan, I think there's at least one very important lesson, which is what printing massive amounts of money can do for an economy. And Japan, in a sense, in terms of the way the global political economy is going, and this, in a sense, underlines or underlies a lot of the kind of understanding of the mechanisms behind this rise of illiberalism. Japan has kept afloat for the past 30 years by printing enormous amounts of money. Its debt to GDP ratio is 250%, which is, much bigger than even Greece at the height of its economic crisis. So this is the context for politics in contemporary Japan at the moment. So within this, what Abe was doing when he was in power, in terms of, he was in power for 7 years, the longest ever. In fact, before he was in power, the average prime minister since 1990 was in power for 18 months. So 7 years is huge. He was able to do it in part because the opposition was in complete disarray, and I'll talk a little bit about that perhaps later if it comes up. But he was able to secure power in part by very much centralizing power underneath himself, which we've seen Trump do, except that Abe has done this in an opposite way. So whereas Trump centralized, has tended to centralize power under himself by either criticizing the bureaucracy as the deep state or just simply not appointing people to key bureaucratic posts, Abe did the opposite, which was to take the naming of key diplomatic posts underneath him. So he unlike in the past where bureaucrats were often a strong kind of counter-positioning to the party in power, which for nearly unbroken rule, for 60 years under the LDP, they were a key oppositional force. But Abe took underneath him naming key bureaucrats. So now, which largely tamed them. The other thing that he did that was very much in a Trumpian kind of mode was to, and we've also seen this in the other discussions so far, is to take a real stranglehold on the media. Now, the Japanese media was never known for being all that controversial or critical of the government, and Abe tamed them even further, in part with the great help of Suga, who's also very much for controlling the message. So he did this first through key political appointments. They had of NHK as an ultranationalist. There was a lot of pressure on key journalists, very, very famous ones on national shows, huge slew of resignations of some of the most important journalists in the country. And also with the new State Secrets Act that made it, which is basically an anti-whistleblower law, it made it illegal to, with very high jail sentences and huge fines, to report on anything deemed a state secret, and anything could be deemed a state secret. So nearly anything could. So, so we've seen the media really line up behind the government, so much so that you can't report on nuclear power in America without this seeming as being political. The third thing that he did that has been quite important, or it relates to Trump in a certain way, is that he's a very strong, very paternalist nationalism, almost really kind of neo-nationalist in its bend. With this has come, so Abe is a member of an organization that's very important to understand what's going on in Japanese politics today, but it's not often really talked about within Japan or outside it, and that's the Nippon Kaigi, or the Japan Conference, which has about 50 to 60,000 members, usually in very prominent positions. So at one point, half the members of the LDP party, of the ruling party in Japan, in government, were members of this association. At one point, I think about 3/4 of Abe's cabinet was members of pretty much a pretty right-wing nationalist association. That part of it is to get out the vote, and part of it is to make sure that these kind of very nationalistic renditions of history get taught in the schools, that there's funding for hyper-nationalist schools, that these sorts of policy things around, if you look at their newsletters, they will, have great questions about whether the Nanjing massacre happened, or the, role of Japan as an imperial power and the atrocities it carried out are seen as recognizing those, are seen as embracing a victimhood status that ought to be eradicated, and a lot of questionable things around that as well. And part of this has gone into then Abe's key policy issue, which was revising the Constitution. And if you look at what he wanted to do to the Constitution, there was a huge gutting of basic human rights, with proposed revisions to nearly all of the articles within the Constitution. So we see a sort of a liberalism moving in the basic fundamentals of the law, and how that operates in terms of simply the rights that people can count on. So I'll stop there. because I think there's also interesting divergences too that we might get to.
We'll get to the divergences in a minute, but I do think these are very interesting parallels. One of the things being those human rights and minority rights, which are so dear to political liberalism and liberal democracy, the reinvention of democracy around a narrowly defined demos, but also the shunning of those minority rights. So it's this idea of popular sovereignty or sovereign democracy is something that we also see, I think, in these different patterns. Now, there's one, I think, important difference with the last case that we'll hear from Claudia, because she's going to be talking about the European Union, which is a different type of structure, politically speaking, a different polity. But it also has, well, let's say not all nation states so far are populated by populists. So I'm curious to hear how that story might differ and how certain patterns might nonetheless be similar with Trumpism in the US and elsewhere.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. I also wondered about this, and it was actually a good occasion to rethink what is the role of my contribution also in this discussion and also in this volume when you hear these very concrete examples. And I would like to begin by a confession and by something that then struck me when looking at the European Union. So the confession is that I'm a convinced pro-European. I'm really a child of the European case. I've been an Erasmus student in France. I loved it. It was my best year ever. It owed me a very strong friendship. I have a French godson, beautiful boy. I just loved it. I learned tremendously out from it. Then I was a Marie Curie researcher, so I got a 2-year very nice research funding in Finland. My career as a researcher is a truly European one, so I have been benefiting from the European Union, well, since the beginning of my studies, I could say, and since the beginning of everything that led me even into my academic career. I also love the benefits that we have. I love traveling to Paris. I just can, well, in the good old days before the pandemic, I could just step into the train in Frankfurt and get out in Paris 4 hours later. No bothering border controls, etc. So all these are benefits, and I'm also convinced that the European Union is based on ideas of the rule of law, democracy, etc., just as it is mentioned in the treaties. So far, so good. Now, the point that struck me, the more and more I became an EU researcher, was that liberalism has a weird effect, and let's say at least an ambivalent effect in the European Union. And I mean liberalism here in the sense of an economic liberalism. And this is actually very interesting when you dive a little bit back into the history of the idea of European integration. I mean, not as far back as the medieval ages and Dante Alighieri and so on, but to Hayek, who is an economic thinker. You will see that this idea of free trade is very virulent in the EU's history of idea. And the background was just, okay, let's use the European Union or European integration as a tool to dismantle and to get around these stressful national welfare states and the national democracies in order to abolish trade barriers in the European Union, which is then very much what happened. European integration for a long time has been based on economic integration. Now, I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but we know that the European welfare states have been built on compromise, on balancing capital and labor, on balancing the interests of free markets and the interests of the persons that live in these welfare states. And now what happened is that the European integration led to dismantling this consensus that is prevalent in many of the European Union states. And that, in my view, is the first thing of the dangers of liberalism, not so much illiberalism, but liberalism in the European Union. So I would like to raise the question whether illiberalism always must be a negative point, and whether how we would conceptualize and discuss the relation between economic liberalism and political liberalism, which is not the same. And Boris and Michael mentioned in the introduction to the book that it has been linked, like in a natural relation, but that's absolutely not the case. So liberal democracy does not come by nature, as we know, if we liberalize the economy. it may be at odds. And I think that's one of the core basic problems that you raise in your introduction. Second point, I have been studying the financial crisis and the effect it has on democracy in the European Union and democracies in Europe. And it struck me that we see very similar things as they happen in populist democracies. And I mean, I underline, that really struck me. I wouldn't have believed my eyes. You see a dismantling of national parliaments. Just take the case of Greece. It's the most blatant case. So Greece, as you all know, was under austerity management. It was under external control by the so-called Troika. So the Troika is a body of experts consisting of experts from the International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission. No direct legitimation, no election behind. Well, very long legitimation chains. And those guys, mostly from the Troika, they arrive in Greece and they dictate the Greek government what they have to put in their budget. And the Greek parliament just then can say yes or no. Now, I'm, as you have guessed, a scholar of the history of ideas, of political thought, and that's not what parliamentarism should be about. We have this very nice German term of Frühstücksdirektor, breakfast director. Yeah, so parliament is reduced into the role of a breakfast director. They can just say, okay, yes, we give the rubber stamp, but they don't do anymore what are the crown jewels of parliamentarism. They don't discuss the budget. And this is very similar to these processes of dismantling democracy as they have been described by the other speakers that have just been presenting the other cases. Now, all this is obviously happening in the name of, you know, the stability of the euro, and nobody intends it to be directed against democracy. But unfortunately, the fact is pretty much the same. And there's a third thing that needs to be mentioned in that context, is that it has been triggering populism. It has been triggering in Greece, even more than populism, a right-wing extremist, nearly neo-Nazi party called Golden Dawn. We see a surge in populism in Europe in relation to this financial crisis. So I think all these effects are linked. And usually if I raise these points, especially in German discussions, people get crazy. And they will sort of shout at me and say, how can you say that? We had no choice. We need to do this, especially in Greece, because the alternative was state bankruptcy. And I think it's a wrong contradiction that is set up here. Yeah, and I think it's very weird and it's very problematic. And I think they sort of the leaders in the European Union, that's probably a decisive difference. They are getting aware of this problem, especially Christine Lagarde, who is the president of the European Central Bank. But it's a structural problem. It's deeply embedded in the EU structure, so it's not so easy to get around these problems. I think I will stop here because I think I have passed my 5 minutes, and I hope to have raised some points.
Thank you so much, Claudia, also for bringing up this tension within liberalism. That's what I was trying to refer to in the beginning, that this crisis isn't something that comes from the outside, right? It's not from Russian spying or from some kind of an external shock that happened, but it's it's a long-term crisis. Juliane mentioned the other book that I co-wrote on the crisis of democracy. What we're talking about there is really the problem that liberalism was understood only as economic liberalism, and that political liberalism, minority rights, human rights, etc., were seen as a natural effect of market expansion, right? Mm-hmm. And so this longer-term crisis is an important one, right? The lack of responsiveness to citizenries, the technocracy of governments. So there are good reasons for Trumpists to be in office, as we said before. But their analysis of the problems of globalization, what we call the politics of no alternative, might be right, but the kinds of countermeasures that they offer, as we, I think, heard from all these different cases, are quite problematic, right? And generative and productive, and redoing the state and redoing democracy in problematic ways. I think Aysuda mentioned in the beginning that it seems like they're learning from one another. And I mean, there have been some conferences between different populists and populist leaders, and there seems to be, almost a playbook that we can see in these different contexts. So the second question that I would like to ask to all of you is really if we also can learn from the way they learn from one another in terms of doing things differently, or to put this slightly differently, what how do your cases differ from the US case? Are there certain things that are specific to the Turkish case, the Japanese case, the Brazilian case, the EU, that could also be maybe grounds for hope if we look at the US democracy? Maybe not an inevitable development that Trump will go down this road further or not. So I'd be curious to hear, and maybe we can just hear your individual perspectives one after another.
Do I start again? Okay, thank you. So I can see a major difference. I mean, you see that one uses Islamism and the other uses evangelical Christianity as tools, but that's not a major difference for me. It's, you know, they're using religious groups in their rhetoric. So such things. But one difference is that it took Erdogan 17 years to get here, 18 years actually at this point. And the first 4 years, he was actually like this disciple of democracy all over the world. He was, you know, seen as the representative of moderate Islam, Islamic democracy, which was not the case for actually Turkish left. Turkish left was always very much aware of his tendencies, but I don't think anyone realized what could happen given time, because nobody expected him to be in power for this long. To be honest. So we don't know what you can do given time. And most probably, I think this is a lesson to be learned. We always thought that no matter what he does, it's not going to get that bad, because we have some mechanisms in place that will stop him. And before he can dismantle them, he will be voted out anyway, because who stays in power that long? He cannot be elected and re-elected again, right? But this is exactly what happened. And he found the time to dismantle all the things that we thought could not be dismantled. And illiberal things too, like the military, which he very rightly opposed as an illiberal institution that was a threat to Turkish democracy. It had always been one. But his solution was to actually replace the old military with his own military, which was just as problematic, which ended up trying to, you know, have a coup and replace them. But it was the generals actually that he brought to power that started this. So I think one thing is not to be confident that there's plenty of time. We can make up for this. The next person that comes will actually, you know, reverse things. That's going to get better. You never know if you have that option. So whenever you can stop something that is really, and I'm not talking about democratic things that the majority wants that you don't prefer, but, you know, yes, they're legitimate. But I'm actually talking about things that border on illegal. That delegitimizes and that threatens democratic institutions, liberal institutions, like the courts, like the media, like civil society, turning them first into enemies and then taking, like establishing legal control over them and threatening them at every point. And this is not a singular thing. There's no single way to counter this, but I think every single individual and institution should be ready to defend their area, like their borders. They should draw a line in the sand and really defend that, because this is not necessarily going to pass. And we don't know if, even if Trump is, for example, not elected, the power, as you know, the previous scholars have actually mentioned, the dynamics that brought him to power, the dynamics that brought all this resentment, you know, up in among the populations around the world are there. And as long as they're there, this is going to, this can and probably will continue in some form with different faces. And I think that would be my big thing. If you want a very minor difference, Erdogan is a great orator. And he's a good speaker, and his command of English is very commendable. It's very good. So looking at him and Trump is kind of shocking, the difference, although they both say very similar things in terms of inciting that resentment and hatred and all that. One does it with quite a bit of rhetorical relish and, you know, sophistication, and the other has, I've read that he has, Trump has the vocabulary of an 8-year-old, average 8-year-old or a 3rd grader. So that's a big difference, but I've seen that it makes no difference. That's interesting. It doesn't make much of a difference, I guess. So that's all.
It even seems to help him, right? I mean, some people have pointed out that it makes him more authentic and less elitist and more connected, perhaps. But it sounds like you're saying there needs to be a double fix, right? There needs to be a fix for what's happening now. There's also needs to be a fix for the roots of the problem that we're facing.
Yes.
Esther, sorry.
Yeah, so I would point out 3 main differences between Bolsonaro and Trump case. The first one is that Bolsonaro is much more an outsider than Trump. Bolsonaro's political party during the 2018 election, the PSL, had just 8 federal congressmen from a total of 513 churches in Brazilian Congress. So it was an absolutely unknown party. Nobody knew really about this political party before. But the thing is that Bolsonaro left his own country, his own party in office in 2019 due to internal disagreements, corruption cases, etc. So he left the party. He founded a new political party, Alliance for Brazil, it's called, a tiny and ridiculous party that currently has no political representation at all. So we live the paradox in Brazil that the president's party has no political representation at all. That's something historical in Brazil, never happened. The second difference is a ultra-militarization of Bolsonaro's government. We have currently 9 military ministers, so the most important figures in Brazilian Bolsonaro's government, except for the Minister of Economic Affairs, they are all from military. We have more than 6,000 people from the army working in the government, 6,000 people. From those 6,000 people, 3,000 people are from active duty working in the government. So they are everywhere. Military men and women are everywhere. Economic affairs, education, environmental, indigenous affairs, international relations, etc. So, for example, when I am asked, is there any risk in Brazil to have a traditional military coup? I always said, well, there's no risk because we have no need. There's really no need for a military coup because the military, they have all the power they really never dreamed about. We have the most militarist government, even compared with the dictatorship period. So this for me is a very highlighting thing to say. And the third difference is the role of the anti-corruption fight in the central figure of car wash operation. Car wash operation, and I think all of you heard about this, about Judge Sergio Moro. Judge Sergio Moro, then after car wash operation and after the victory of Bolsonaro, went to the government of Bolsonaro, became the Minister of Justice, and then left the government accusing Bolsonaro of corruption. So car wash operation led to a very anti-partisan feeling in the society, and of course in a very powerful anti-workers party feeling in the society. Car wash operation led to a very powerful criminalization and destruction of politics, and from this destruction, Bolsonaro presented himself as the only savior, the messiahs, the outsider, the only honest politician that could save Brazil from the political, economical, and ethical destruction. So I would say that I always say that car wash operation was fundamental to lead Bolsonaro to the government, and I think these 3 main differences are the most important ones to understand why Bolsonaro could really never say that is the exact tropical Trump.
That's interesting, even though, I mean, some of the things you just said do remind me of Trump. I mean, you're certainly right that Trump hasn't quite militarized his own government as much, even though we have seen some very important military figures which tended to resist Trump in the first in the first 4 years of his administration. But maybe also a difference that, I mean, even though he's constantly accusing his opponents as enemies and also threatening to lock them up, that hasn't quite happened yet. So maybe there's also a major difference in the kind of pace in which Bolsonaro has moved and Trump has moved. Aysuda said there's 17 years in power, that Erdogan was sort of mutating and going through different reincarnations. That doesn't seem to necessarily be necessary when we think of the Bolsonaro case. Huh?
Mm-hmm. So turning to Japan for some of the differences. I think one of the big differences compared to the US in particular is that rather than turning inwardly, Japan has ever more increasingly turned outward. So Abe traveled abroad more than any prime minister in Japanese history, not merely because he was in power for a long time, but because he was just on a plane all the time. In fact, he was the first foreign head of state to meet Trump after he was elected, in part because he was on his way to South America and thought, okay, no, I'm going to stop over in New York on my way there. He's also had a pretty good relationship with Trump, called in the Japanese media sometimes known as the Trump whisperer. And so Japan has traditionally, ever since the end of World War II, had a very close relationship with the US, in part because the US has a lot to do with Japanese, quote unquote, self-defense and military policy. So Japan has treated that as a very important relationship to maintain, and so they've done that with Trump as well. However, they've gone in the past 7 years, gone around and signed as many treaties with other countries as they possibly can. The TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Trump killed almost immediately, Japan has taken up the banner of, and has 11 countries that it's trying to get together in that. And so in part, Japan's also very concerned about the rise of China, which is something that, the US impacts these relationships in the US as well. And so Japan is thinking, with an eye to that too. So in that sense, it looks a little bit different. We also haven't seen, as to such a great degree, the capture of democracy by wealth and the interests of wealth. In part, that has to do with the structure of inequality in Japan. And of course, that's been increasing greatly ever since the 1990s, so that about 1 in 6 Japanese people and 1 in 6 Japanese children lives in poverty, which, if you compare Japan to countries in Europe, almost every single country in Europe is less unequal, or Japan is more unequal than almost every single country in the European Union now, which is not an image that many people have of it today. Nonetheless, at the very high end of the wealth spectrum, you don't see these huge billionaires that you get, for example, in the US. So that means in terms of the relationship between government and business, it really is a very close relationship with big business. And that's defined Japanese politics ever since the 1950s. And that's an important thing to keep in mind, and the US has been in part behind that as well. So that's meant that it hasn't been a hijacking of government, but that tight government, big business relationship has continued on. And finally, I think the most important part is that neither Abe nor Suga are populists. They're not very, photogenic, exciting people. The last prime minister to be that, and probably the first one actually, because they're usually really boring, was Junichiro Koizumi, who was, nicknamed Elvis, because he had flowing hair. I mean, that's enough. You don't even have to be a good public speaker. You just have to have flowing hair to be a populist prime minister in Japan. So, we're not talking about a very high standard, and Abe and Suga certainly are not in there. They are, however, very, very nationalistic, bordering on ultra-nationalistic sometimes, or neo-nationalistic at least. But what's interesting there is that it's a complex relationship. So, for example, Japan, there hasn't been a huge, strong anti-immigration rhetoric coming out of Abe. In fact, he's opened doors to more foreign workers than other prime ministers have. Now, in part, that's possible because it's been pretty low immigration in the first place. And, the suppression of multicultural issues in Japan has, been continuing and going on for a very long time. So if you start at 0, it's kind of hard to go below that in a sense. What's also been interesting in his very conservative attempts to revise the Constitution was that he was willing to adopt the rhetoric that was pro-environmentalist, pro-LGBT, we need to revise the Japanese constitution because it says that a marriage is between a man and a woman, and we need to get it into the 21st century in order to get younger voters out there to support him in this. So in that sense, it's been a slightly, at the same time, he will also, women in the household, women cannot have, a family has to have the same last name, a husband and wife can't have different last names. This sort of stuff comes in too. So we're not talking about a real kind of, social progressive at that, but still willing to adopt some of this rhetoric that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And part of this wraps into a big difference, it sounds like, also between the Brazilian and the Turkish cases, that there's not so much a politics of fear in Japan, in part because this is the system. Abe came out of the LDP, which has been in power almost continuously since 1955. He comes out of a political, family. His grandfather was prime minister. He was also almost tried for war crimes and put in, held for them for a while. So this is, really within the system. What's important and what might be interesting to think through with the other cases as well is that there is no serious political opposition in Japan right now. And this has been a product of the Cold War. So before the Cold War, there was a socialist party that did have an ideological difference with the ruling LDP party. And, it got, 30% of the voters. So it was serious. The Communist Party was also a serious party in Japan. After 1990 and the end of the Cold War, they pretty much did themselves in. And that, you get kind of sort of new labor Blairite parties that have come up, but, and they did hold power for 3 years because people are really kind of sick and tired of the LDP, which has been in, pretty much continuous rule. But they completely undid themselves, and now there's no serious opposition to the ruling party, and there's no serious opposition within the ruling party either. In part because the current Prime Minister Suga, when he was Chief Cabinet Secretary, was able to pull everybody in line and really tame the internal party opposition that used to be sort of an alternative place where things in a democratic way could be, or rather than having opposition come out in the polls, at least come out within the party. And so that's been tamed as well. So in Japan, it is the system. You don't need the politics of fear. There is no alternative. And as a result, voter turnout has declined, which seems like it'll also be a big difference with the upcoming US election, which people are predicting to be one of the biggest voter turnouts in a long time, even if there's not so much, perhaps, ideological difference between Republicans and Democrats.
Fascinating. I mean, one thing that we've been trying to think about in this project is to what degree these differences between different types of illiberal actors are differences of degree or differences of kind. And I think the Japanese case is an interesting one because it seems like Abe did very much cherry pick different types of populist policies, but didn't have to tap into the full register of that. So sometimes I wonder if, in analogy to this varieties of capitalism literature, there could be something like a varieties of illiberalism literature, and maybe even clusters of different types. That's very interesting, especially this idea of the politics of fear, that it's not needed in this case because of the specific institutional functions. I think is a very interesting observation, and maybe also holds true for the European case, Claudia.
What exactly holds true?
Oh, that there's not the same kind of politics of fear, and maybe as one element. I mean, I do see major differences between the EU case and the American case.
Okay, so after having spread the bad news of the European case, it's probably time for the good news. I mean, obviously, there is a many huge differences to the America of Donald Trump. So the first difference is that I would say that the public discourse is not as split as it is in the US, where really there are two camps that are not even able to speak to each other. So we see this starting in Europe, but I would say that it's a mission in the European Union as a polity, and I'm speaking about the European Union here, to be based on open deliberation. So it's in a way the raison d'être, yeah. So the state doctrine of the European Union that is not a state, to be based on open deliberation. I'm not saying it always happens, and you have these hard barriers also in the public discourse, but nothing is happening to fuel it. The problem that we have in the democracy in the European Union is rather one of technocracy and efficiency versus democracy. And this is in a way what frightens me, because technocracy doesn't always mean, okay, it might mean to have the best solutions, but it doesn't always mean that those are democratically legitimate solutions. So I think it's a decisive difference again, because Donald Trump would probably never believe in technocracy. He's very anti-technocracy, very, I'm the real people and those allies, those technocrats, those academics, we don't need them. Whereas in the European Union, you would rather see an overweight, like the legitimation of austerity regimes comes from the fact that there are economists behind it and they have sort of designed and calculated it. That would be a second difference. And then the third difference is probably that a lot of leaders in the European Union are aware of the problems that have been mentioned, which does not mean they are able to find solutions. But a number are aware, which is already a good thing. And when you listen to Donald Trump, well, okay, there's this new book on Donald Trump and Corona, and that he knew that Corona was very deadly, but he just didn't tell this. So maybe he's more aware than I would say, but the public impression that he gives is that he is not aware of the problems. And this is not the public impression that give the leaders of the EU, in the sense of Christine Lagarde, Ursula von der Leyen, and the European Parliament. They would say, okay, we are aware. We are aware that we have a problem when it comes to refugees. We are aware that the governance of authority, it created huge legitimacy problems. We need to do something about it. And the problem is more that the devil is in the details. It's so difficult to find this solution. So I would say that those are three very decisive differences. But it doesn't mean there are no dangers. This is also something that people tend to confuse in the European Union, that because there is awareness of the problem, it's not going to be that problematic, and that's not the same. And let me mention a fourth point, because something that I couldn't mention here because it wasn't my role is that we have similar persons as Bolsonaro and Trump in Europe. First to mention Viktor Orban, who is sort of running in a very similar train as also Erdogan in Turkey. And this creates a major problem. There's Poland as well, and they sort of try to pressurize the European Union into another direction, as we currently see in the question or in the debate about the COVID rescue package, where they sort of exert pressure saying, if you pressure us to follow the rule of law, we pressure you because we will not vote for the COVID rescue package. Yeah, so there is a trade-off that you see. So to sum up the dangers, it's the same dangers probably as in the US, but in very different roles or functions, I would say.
I think this idea of timing is a very important one, that politicians can react to what's happening in real time. They might be able to learn from one another in terms of policy and ideological positions and so on and so forth. But so can those who try to resist illiberalism. One of the insights of the year for me has been to rethink the 1930s, and many people have done so. But one of the things that I realized, and why I think such a comparative perspective is so important, is that we tend to think, for example, of the US case, the welfare state, the New Deal order, the Fordist period as an intrinsic development, right, of activists and politicians deciding to have two big bangs of the welfare state, right? Not quite the same welfare state as in Europe, of course, as in other places, but nonetheless, an intrinsic development. When we look at this from a global perspective, and also when we reread the 1930s from a global perspective, I think much of the social policy that came out of the US in the 30s and in the 60s was an attempt to bind the working classes back to the state through social policy, for the workers not to become fascist, for the workers not to become communist. And so sometimes I'm wondering what this means for our particular moment right now. What are the counter movements? Is there something like a nascent counter position that is not the return to the status quo ante? I mean, this is why many people have problems with Joe Biden on the left, because he might represent just that. Right? Is there some kind of a new something nascent that might also create a narrative of hope, perhaps? Okay, the first questions are coming in, and the first one actually goes to Claudia Wiesner, and I'm going to read them out. And so, if you want to use the Q&A button, please do. And I'm trying to take in as many questions as possible. Claudia, the question is. So there's understanding for including the economy, that this makes sense to factor it in to understand the entire situation. How about China in comparison? And I think what this is pointing to is, China seems to be very powerful, doing very well right now because of its economic growth. So is that an alternative model perhaps to the liberal democracy? Is that also one important dimension of the story that we haven't talked about yet?
Yes, this is absolutely right, I would say. I discuss these questions of the future of the European Union quite often because I'm a professor of political science with an emphasis on EU studies, and I have this background in the history of ideas. So this perspective seems to invite people to ask you, so what do you think on the future of Europe? And it was especially my stays in the US in 2019 and 2020 that really supported me in this idea that indeed China is a point and a weight in the debate. It's a weight also in Europe because people start to think about how to deal with China actually, because China in a way is even more of a counter model to the European Union than is the US. China is everything that the EU is not. So it's an autocracy, like black and white, following all criteria that we have in comparative politics. But they are economically very successful, and they use all the sort of means of maneuver that they shouldn't use, as according to the ideas of a liberal world order and the World Trade Organization. So they try to create quasi-monopolies, etc., etc. And people already start to talk of war in trade that relates to China. Now, the first point, or the big question for the European Union, is how to position itself in between this. Sometimes I heard, and I find this very frightening, people asking the questions, okay, can we at all win against China? If China is a very efficient autocracy and we are very complex, we have these 27 member states, we have Brexit, and we have, democracy. And that really frightens me because my opinion is a different one. My opinion really would be that Europe is a success model. Also, by the way, compared to the United States. And you might, I know there was also a comment in the chat. I know that in the US, this is frequently termed a socialist position. But I would like to underline that what I'm saying now is not at all socialist, at least in European terms. It's just saying that integrating a welfare state and a liberal free market economy results in something that Ludwig Erhard, who is by no means a socialist, but a good Christian conservative Democrat in Germany, termed social market economy. It means a kind of compromise between a certain level of a welfare state and a certain level of liberal market economy. And I would like to underline that all our empirical findings say that this makes an economy much more profitable than if it's an autocracy such as China, or if it's in a way the opposite, like an ultra-liberal economy with very huge inequalities as the US now is, or as is Brazil. I just read a comment on America's detrimental state just before the elections. And even analysis and even people from the banking and financial sector start to realize that these huge social inequalities in America are a problem for the American economy. And it's very simple. Why? The article simply said, okay, American schools, they either educate people for becoming researchers and going to high-level universities, or they educate them to be selling French fries. But there's nothing in between. And from my experience in the US, I have the hunch that there's a lot of truth in this statement. And the European success model always has been to build this middle class and to have stable democracies, building on stable welfare states with different models. Yeah, and again, this is not, socialist, but you can term it a European-like compromise of welfare state and democracy. So this is also to conclude why I think that Europe has a good stance, both against China and the US and in between China and the US.
And I mean, it is true that in the US, there was a tendency of embedding liberalism in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and trying to expand the welfare state, even though that didn't exist before. And social democracy was not a swear word at the time. Nonetheless, I just wanted to say, all the panelists feel free to chime in on the questions. I don't want to direct all the conversation here. So if you want to add something to this particular question of China or so, just open your mic and answer it. So this can become more of a conversation rather than us going through the individual questions. I mean, there's a very technical, very specific question on the current situation with regard to populism in Great Britain and Boris Johnson's role in it, and the US-British and British-EU relationships in the wake of Brexit. The question is very open. So whether you have any thoughts on this type of special relationship and on Brexit itself, I mean, maybe thinking also about the way forward. I mean, what kind of an impact might this have on the things we've been discussing so far?
Well, I can speak from my position here in London, where I've been a party to this as a third country, or not yet, third country national, for the past several years. Boris is taking a lot of cues from, or at least Dominic Cummings, his chief advisor, is taking a lot of cues from Trump in terms of how to manage government in the media and image and those sorts of things. So that has been key. And Boris has done a lot to try to keep Britain's so-called special relationship to the US as special as he can, while recognizing that it's actually very difficult to work with the US at this point in time. So people at the Foreign Office would sometimes not even know who their American counterparts are when they're trying to figure out what's going on. So it's been interesting here where, obviously negotiating free trade agreements after this year will be very critical for the UK. There's been debates within the Conservative Party whether or not actually support for Biden would be better because Trump would take a harder line in any kind of trade deal with the UK, and that Biden is probably less likely to do that. So it's been interesting to see the divisions within the Tory party in the UK. There's been a much stronger backbench rejection of Boris Johnson than there has been, I think, within the Republican Party in the US, which has pretty much lined up behind Trump. After 4 years. Initially, there were more critical voices, but now the Republican Party, key leaders like Lindsey Graham, for example, rarely go against him. Whereas we still see within the Tory party in the UK, rejection of what Boris Johnson has been doing. But that said, the fact that the UK did have a referendum, which probably shouldn't have, because thinking about what's been said about the EU has been like, if the EU doesn't do very well in terms of referendum support. When it seems like the vote might go to the people, most countries say we reject being a member of the EU. And so there's been in general a prevention of that going on, which is interesting to think about in terms of the EU as a fundamentally democratic or as a fundamentally technocratic institution as well.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, again, I think the question is, at what point do we see, some people are interpreting Brexit as sort of a signal for the EU maybe also to reorganize and to reconstitute itself and to gain a new type of identity and to rethink itself. And so maybe, yeah, I'm wondering if there is a counter movement that's beginning, but you're certainly right that the kind of technocracy of the EU institutions is still being criticized. In fact, there's just a great new show that's, I think on Arte or so, that is mocking exactly that mostly interns would run the EU Commission and the Parliament, and ultimately, the politicians there don't have much to say and are very gray bureaucrats that don't even understand how the system works. So it's become a cliche, but this is not something that will be easily undone. Another question that goes to the EU is about Germany more specifically. After all, we are at the Deutsches Haus. So, and some of us are actually in Germany right now. Aysuda, who's talking about Turkey, is also in Germany, and so is Claudia. So we do have a sort of first-hand experience of what is going on. And the question is, what our prognosis would be for how the AfD will do in the German elections next year, because the federal German elections are coming up. And so what would be your takes on this? Yeah, feel free to jump in.
Yeah. Well, this is again making educated guesses, but my educated guess is that they will not be scoring as good as they did before. Not if we do not face a major problem in the COVID pandemic management. Because so far we have seen the AfD very silent during the COVID pandemic, except for a few demonstrations of those anti-corona measures activists. They have not been very successful in the public debate. They have barely been visible. And what is more, they have huge internal problems because they have this extreme right wing, Björn Höcke and others, who is in a crucial fight with the more moderate extreme right in the party. So I think the AfD really is a very dangerous right-wing extremist party. A comparative colleague from Colombia told me that they are among the sort of most extreme right in Europe, which means something because we also have Rassemblement National in France, etc. And particularly the extreme right of AfD, Björn Höcke and others, they are really like, I think they want another Germany. They are not fans of democracy. But since now they are in a clash with the more moderate parts, I don't think it will increase the chances of AfD because their voters won't like it. So my guess would be they would score less. They will not disappear for some time, and especially in Eastern Germany, I think they will stay a considerable political force. But this again, sorry for making this point again, brings me back to the point about welfare state and about, you know, social class, because they took up a lot of the electorate of the former left party that no vote for AfD. So there is an issue there, I would say.
Yeah, and a critique we've seen often in the US context that Biden shouldn't just be about the anti-Trump, right? That liberal elites would also have to think about what actually went wrong at an earlier point in time. So I think there must be a moment of reckoning probably to make sense of this. There's some great questions now coming in. I don't know, Aysuda, if you want to weigh in. Okay, well, I mean, the polls for the AfD have been pretty weak. They've been polling around 9%, 10%, 11%. The last result in the last German federal elections was 12.5, if I remember correctly. And they've been up all the way to 17 and 18 at earlier points. So the Corona crisis didn't do the same trick as it did for other populist parties in other places. And again, there's maybe something about the specific political system that has an impact on how these forces unfold. There's a question about religion and the appointment of the conservative Supreme Court Justice, Amy Coney Barrett, that played an important role in the Trump US context. What role, if any, has faith played in your specific case studies, and how might religion be contextualized in the context of illiberalism? So what is the role of religion in populism in your context?
Well, I can definitely speak to that. Erdogan was an Islamist from the beginning, and that's how he defined himself. You know, unlike Trump, who was never known as a religious person, he came from a religious background, from a religious movement, from his youth on. He was active in politics as an Islamist. So when I talk about resentment and when I talk about identity, the main identity that he held on to and the way he defined the Turkish nation was through religion, which was Sunni Islam, which he presented as a moderate democratic version of Sunni Islam. But in the end, as I said, it excludes a big number of the population in Turkey. It excludes non-Sunni Muslims, so non-Muslims for sure, and the non-Sunnis within the Muslim population. And on top of that, anyone who is viewed as secular, even those who see themselves as Muslims. So defining yourself as a Muslim does not count if you don't live a particular type of Islamic life in this view. So it's very easy to say, okay, these people are the other and they don't represent the morality of our people. And in the Turkish case, of course, there's this big anti-imperialist, paranoid discourse against the West too, that then the seculars, as they call them, or in Turkish, the laïc from the French word, those are in cahoots with the West. They tried to, they westernized the country, which is okay if you're just talking about technical stuff, but they want to westernize our morality. They must westernize our culture. And this is one of the biggest debate points has always been of the Justice and Development Party in Turkey. So whenever whenever the opposition makes a move, there's a critique coming from the opposition, they can always try to paint them as the other, as not part of the nation, by pointing out the ways in which their lifestyles are not particularly Islamic or Turkish. It's gotten very old. And I've been comparing these two actually in the United States. And usually when I talk about the evangelical movement in the United States, the reaction in Turkey is they're really baffled and they are really surprised, the secular people in Turkey, by the similarities in the rhetoric of particularly against against the secular groups. It's a very similar rhetoric. And the focus on sexual morality, almost an obsession with sexual morality, is very similar. Whereas secular groups and opposition has been trying to shift the focus and definition of morality, of ethics. For example, saying that corruption is an issue of morality, any kind of non-sexual morality should be discussed. But whenever the conversation starts again, the governing party brings it back to sexuality. It could be the LGBT, it could be abortion, it could be equality of women. When they say, yes, women should be equal, but they're different by nature. God has given them a different nature, therefore our laws and customs reflect that and should continue to reflect that. So there's this big tension. And I see that reflected very much in the American case. And America is kind of exceptional in that regard in the West, I think, because I see nothing of the sort in Europe. There's nothing similar in Europe that I can see, especially in Western Europe. But America, by being a very religious country, has shown a similar tendency. And I'll add one last thing. American Christians have been secularizing and losing faith in record numbers in a very fast pace in the last decade. And the same thing is happening in Turkey under Erdogan's government. The more the government focuses on religiosity and brings religion into classrooms, to TVs, everything, the more the Turkish youth has turned away from religion. And Turkey has never been so secular. In fact, it's very hard to measure because people are scared to talk about this, but all the research that is done with the youth, especially people, children with coming from religious conservative backgrounds, show that they've rejected Islam altogether. A growing number. I mean, we're talking about a very religious country, so when I say large, we don't know the extent of it, but an increasing number of both male and female youth is rejecting Islam altogether and defining themselves as non-religious, but believing in God, deists. This is the term that's preferred right now. And the governing party is actually is an alarm over this issue. And I see that similarity to this rejection by especially this Z generation of religion, because, and this is similar too, they look at politics and they look at the role that religion plays in politics, and all they see is, this is what the youth has been saying in research, that they see corruption and they reject that corruption and they reject that politics of polarization, and they see a lot of hypocrisy and they reject that hypocrisy, and somehow they identify this with Islam and they reject both of them at the same time as they reject their parents' ideology. And I see that similarity.
So in the case of Brazil, this is absolutely very, very important. The most important leaders of Pentecostal and Neo-Pentecostal churches in Brazil gave their support to Bolsonaro, and this was crucial for his victory. Bolsonaro presented himself as a defender of the traditional values, of the morality, of the family, of Christian values, demonizing the Workers' Party and presenting the Workers' Party as the great enemy of faith, as a great enemy of family. So presenting the Workers' Party as the main supporter of abortion, as a supporter of the sexualization of children, etc. So Bolsonaro was the main option for these conservative Christian groups, because he was a man of family, he was a man of faith, and he was the only politician that should protect religion. The thing in Brazil is that religious lobby in the Congress is increasingly very important. We have political parties, we have huge media companies, and the great paradox is that this huge political religious lobby grown exponentially with the Workers' Party, because the Workers' Party allowed this growth in exchange of political support. So the Workers' Party that is demonized currently, presented by Bolsonaro as an anti-faith party, it was a party that allowed this exponential growth of these Pentecostal and Neo-Pentecostal churches in Congress. But as we said before, we have to go to the roots of the problem. And the main important problem is in Brazil. If we ask ourselves why poor people, because this is mainly an issue among poor people, why poor people should vote in these evangelical representatives, or why poor people should vote in Bolsonaro, because he presents himself as the leader of family, of morality, or Christian values. In Brazil, in the slums area, in periphery areas, in favela areas, we have absolutely no presence of the state. We have, of course, absolutely no presence of a welfare state at all. We have huge levels of misery, of poverty, and the only presence of any institutions are these evangelical Pentecostals and Neo-Pentecostal churches. So people trust them because these churches are the only ones offering material support, psychological support, spiritual support, and the states offer nothing. And mainly, this is very crucial for left parties now in Brazil. We are discussing these things in Brazil, that not even state offers nothing in these slum periphery areas, but many times left parties, they do offer nothing to these slum periphery areas, and we have only the churches, and these poor people, they can't only with these churches.
There's a question about the Polish case, and maybe, I don't know, Claudia, if you feel comfortable saying something about it, maybe also relating it to this question of religion. As you said, there are some populists or liberals that we see at the national scale within the EU that seem to be using quite the same tactics as other populists elsewhere. So I don't know if you want to speak to this Polish case and the illiberal tendencies that we're seeing there.
What is the exact question? Could you read it?
It's a very open question,
Okay.
which says that they're, well, basically it's focusing more on the courts, right? So how is maybe the Polish case similar to these other illiberal cases? And what does the court rulings and the way that the Polish government has acted, how is that similar?
Okay, so I would say it's very similar. Actually, the comparison, I'm a comparativist as well, tells us that the illiberal tendencies use similar means. In the last General Conference of the European Consortium of Political Research, I attended a number of panels on populism, and one was particularly interesting. It was on populism and gender roles. And it shows that what was just mentioned about women and their role in society is the same. It's sort of you see the same motives, but I would say with different colors in all of those right-wing populist movements. By the way, you also see it in AfD, since there was this question about AfD. And to my great astonishment, very few German analysts mention it. AfD has this very same natalist, very same honest men and honest women, women's places in kitchen with the children, men earn money, etc. Stance as the Polish peace and as Erdogan and as Orban and all those that have been mentioned. Only it's not put most in front in their ideology and in their public perception. So in looking at the Polish case, I would say it seems to be something that works in Poland, and probably it's something that works much less in Germany. Work in the sense of brings you votes. So what could be the explanation? Poland has a very Catholic tradition. It's a very conservative Catholicism. We have this very famous Pope that was a Pole, and he was a very convinced Christian, but he was also very conservative in values, etc. I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but apparently the Polish right-wing populists suggest to speak very successfully to those values of a decisive part of the Polish population. And they seem to say that those values are in danger by another that is constructed in a certain way. And it's amalgamated with those other elements that we have been hearing about all the time, as used by Bolsonaro, by Erdogan, by Orban, etc., which is limiting the rule of law, which is limiting the balance of powers, which is exchanging judges as they see fit. So they repeatedly have infringement procedures in front of the European Court of Justice, because the Court of Justice every second time says, no, you must not do this, or this is not valid. This is not a valid judicial reform. So we see a lot of the same tendencies. I would say it's probably as dangerous but less advanced than things are in Hungary, if that answers the question about.
Yeah, I think it does. Thank you, Claudia. Yeah, the true demos that we talked about, right? This idea that the true demos needs to lead and that the leader is the representative of that will of the people that is very narrowly defined. That true demos seems to be a very, very patriarchal one oftentimes, and one that is pre-modern almost. So this yearning for the past, for some kind of an almost irredeemable past, really, is something I think that we see in many different contexts. Now, on a happier note, there are a couple of questions I think that I would like to bind together, which are about hope, basically. So how to get out of these conundrums. One of them is specifically about the higher education, the role of higher education in countering some of these illiberal trends. So do you see a specific role for us, maybe also as scholars? Maybe we're overemphasizing our own role too often. Maybe not. Maybe there is a specific role for universities in your context and the way you think about illiberalism. And more generally speaking, so how can we think about ways out of this danger to liberal democracy?
Well, Boris, you know my situation. I'm basically in exile in Germany because we thought as academics we could actually oppose the government, and we did. It wasn't that big a deal anyway. It was not something we thought it was such a big move, but you know, it was met with quite a big force from the government, and a lot of us had to leave Turkey. I'm one of them. So this is the thing. Turkish academics reacted to the Turkish government and autocratizing policies from the beginning. And increasingly, when the media was got out of the way, and when the judiciary got out of the way, when the military got out of the way, every kind of power center got out of the way of the regime, basically the only thing left was the people on the street. And it's very hard to get people onto the street in such an environment, or the universities, the campuses. And it was both actually the students and the academics that remain as the biggest, and a few civil society organizations, particularly, and oddly maybe for you, but organizations that represent professions like lawyers and engineers and all that. So what we saw was that it's possible to crush academia. It takes a lot of force, and the resistance can continue nonetheless. What surprises me, though, is that that resistance that still continues in Turkey to some degree does not exist in Europe or in the United States. We've been like fascinated by the lack of resistance in Western academia. And I'm talking about Western Europe and North America, not Eastern Europe, because I see similar patterns in Eastern Europe, like there's academic resistance to authoritarianism. And that's partially, I think, because Western academics are still in disbelief and they don't really believe that their governments are autocratizing, that they're like, it's not really happening here, it can't happen here. There's that feeling. But also the funding structures in Western universities have left them quite open to autocratization, and it has depoliticized them in a way that even Turkish universities were not. We were depoliticized through brute force. It's not a very smart way of doing things. The way Western governments have done it, whether intentionally or unintentionally, I really don't know. I think it's mostly unintentional, but through very complex funding structures, they've made academics dependent on short-term funding, and it left them in very precarious economic situations. And being involved in any kind of political activity becomes very luxurious when you're trying to find employment for the next year, for the next 6 months. And when there are academics who are homeless in the United States, when there are academics who live on unemployment benefits for a year or longer in Germany. So that level of precarity for such an educated labor force has brought quite a bit of depoliticization. And so academic freedoms kind of remain on paper, but they're not realized in the West. And coming from non-Western countries, that becomes more obvious, the level of inactivity on campuses. Students are more active, but again, I don't see much hope coming from Western academia because of these structures. If Western academia could actually focus on saving itself from this precarity, it could focus, become an actor, as a civil society actor that could have a say. Where I find hope is that individual academics who are doing amazing work, which are being seen as threats by authoritarian regimes because of the way they challenge the things that we just talked about, this fragile masculinity that these regimes are built on, that need to prove that they're men, their manhood constantly. And any challenge to those gender norms is very threatening to these regimes and to these leaders, for example. So gender studies, peace studies, history, studies of history, because all these regimes are also built on ideas of a glorious history, of a golden past. And history departments challenge that. Political science departments challenge the lies that we tell ourselves about our current regime and puts it in comparative perspective, for example. And I'm not just talking about authoritarians, but we all do that about our countries. So I think individual studies have that potential, but they need to be disseminated through the media. They need to reach the people to be, you know, so that's, I find hope in that. That's all I'll say.
Well, I absolutely agree with Aysuda in the role of university. In Brazil, universities played a very crucial role against Bolsonaro. And for that, we suffer, well, the repression of Bolsonaro's government. So, but I think we need to democratize more universities, and we need to open universities for society. That's for me so important. University needs to be a privileged place to fight against authoritarianism. We need more politics inside university. We always need politics, but nowadays we really need more politics, more fights, and more activity in university. But I think answer it in a more general point of view. If we think, how can we, where's the way out, and how can we fight this extreme right, this far right movements? We should, of course, fight the roots of for me, the most important thing is to fight the roots of the resentment. The resentment, we said before, Bolsonaro, Trump, Erdogan, etc., transform this resentment into hate. So, for example, in Brazil, It's absolutely crucial, necessary to fight this resentment. And to fight these resentments means mostly to fight against structural inequality, against structural poverty, against structural racism. Poverty, inequality, or racism are the three most dangerous structural things in Brazil that led to Bolsonaro election. And of course, a very elite and a very corrupted politics. So, and of course we need, and that is for me very desperate, we need to give answers to the economic crisis. We need to give answers to unemployment. We need to give answers, for example, in Brazil, we have now working for Uber, more than almost 1 million people working for Uber in Brazil. So we need to give answers to this process of Uberization of labor. And we need, of course, to strengthen institutions. We need to strengthen education. We need to strengthen a free press, and we need to stress justice. One of the main problems in Brazil, as I said before, is that car wash operation and Judge Sergio Moro led to a very weak justice system, because it was a very partisan justice system and a very weak justice system. So we have to strengthen all of that. And I think a very important thing, for example, in Brazil, is that we need to build a democratic alternative. And it means, for example, first of all, to strengthen the left, the Workers' Party, for example, the most political party nowadays in Brazil, with the largest number of governors, of deputy. But even more important, we need to strengthen the center democratic rights. What happened in Brazil in 2018 election is that the traditional center-right party, the PSDB, almost disappeared because the traditional voters from this center-right party migrated to Bolsonaro. So the candidate of this PSDB country received less than 5% of the total number of votes, something ridiculous. So we need to build this solid center-right alternative, because these millions of conservative Brazilians, for example, will never vote for PT, for the Workers' Party. And if we don't build this strong center-right political party, we will always have the risk that these conservative people migrate to far-right electoral options.
Maybe I can just follow up on this. I mean, if the crisis is really a double crisis that we're seeing, globally speaking, and this is about the imminent tensions of liberalism, economic versus political liberalism, for example, is one major tension. And so if we have this long-term crisis and the immediate crisis of populists in office or illiberals in office, I guess that the solution needs to be a double fix, right? And it needs to be something that encounters the tendencies of undermining the institutions, the imaginaries of the demos, the way that tyranny of the majority is hindered institutionally, and so on. So very Enlightenment ideas, basically, and structures. But then also, obviously, it needs to be about trying to address those long-term tendencies of crisis, technocracy, lack of responsiveness, money in politics, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a lot on our plate. I don't know if Kristin and Claudia also wanted to weigh in on either the higher education question or the fixing of the problem, which obviously is huge.
I mean, I really liked Aysuda's point about what can academics actually do when they are in precarious situations. I'm now myself a professor since 2 years, and Germany is one of those countries where there are permanent positions, but not so many of them, and the way to reach one of them is particularly long. So I know what that means to be chasing the next contract. I mean, you get relaxed about it, but it's absolutely true that you just don't have the time and liberty to dedicate yourself to political engagement. And what is more is that there has been this tendency in only counting, publications in journals with a high impact factor. So those may be very good publications, but they are not really directed at the general public or at explaining general problems. That's not something that is very rewarding in academia these days. So I think that is a very important point, and I think that sort of, again, if academics are publicly funded, as it is the case in most of the countries that we are speaking about, they should have public function. It doesn't only consist in publishing in high impact journals that are then read by a very specialized public. But to have a good news is that I think that there is 2 or 3 things that higher education still can do. So first of all, once you have reached this position, and the good news is that I'm a functionary of the German state, I'm a full professor, so I can very hardly, it's very, 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 how can I say that, improbable that I get fired. I would literally have to steal silver or anything in the president's office to get fired. And so there is a huge liberty that I have, and I consider this also a responsibility to discuss political questions with my students. And by the way, also I took a public stance against AfD. And that is maybe probably a very interesting story in that context. Because when I came back from the US last year, I was really aware that, okay, this is a problem and I have a role because I discuss politics in Europe and democracy with my students. So probably somebody has to tell them that, okay, here is a danger for German democracy. So we did this seminar about the European elections and my students sort of kept asking me, okay, so Professor Wiesner, AfD, etc. So what do you think about it? And I said, okay, listen. So here is the political scientist judgment about AfD. It's not my personal opinion. And I tell you that as according to all criteria, this party is a right-wing extremist party, and it's a danger for representative democracy. And they were like, aha, okay. Because I just wanted to tell them. Then I said, okay, now, I'm not telling you sort of what to vote for, but it's obviously your choice. But here is my opinion as a political scientist. What happened then was that 6 weeks later or so, a guy arrives in my office hours saying, Professor Wiesner, some friends of mine have approached me. There is the rumor that you will mark AfD voters with a bad mark in the written exam. And I was really like white with fury. And I said, okay, first of all, this is an absolute lie. It's absolutely untrue. Second, how would I know this? And third, I would never do this. And the student said, yes, but my friends believe this is the case and they are going to complain with the president. They are going to write a letter of complaint to the president. So then I told him, okay, very good, many greetings to your friends. They can write the letter, but the next day there is a public complaint with the Attorney General, Staatsanwalt. So I really threatened them with a lawsuit. Do this and you have a lawsuit the next day. So the guy came back to see me in my lunch break and said, well, I've talked to my friends again, and it seems it has been a misunderstanding. Then a few months later, I talked to the university president. And I said, okay, Mr. Kaksa, our president, he's a great guy. I said, this has happened to me, and I just wanted you to know the story. And then the president looked at me and said, yes, do you know what happened to me? Because he also is a convinced Democrat. And in the Senate of Fulda University, he had said that he would invite any representative of a democratic political party to his university, except AfD. What happened then is that AfD in the Hessian parliament made a public query, öffentliche Anfrage, asking, so why does the Fulda University president dare to invite all the other parties, but not us? So the president looks at me and says, okay, so they have us under attack. They look at us, and we must be aware of this. This tells you, I mean, this is Germany we are talking about. So we are not at all in the situation as people are in Turkey, etc. But I think this is severe enough. I was lucky to have this president, but at the same time, I saw that he receives the same pressure. But that also tells me that apparently there is an effect. So it seems it hurts what I said in my seminar, because otherwise they wouldn't have reacted. So I would really like to stay with the good news that especially those of us that are in a safe and secure situation must speak out. It must not, or it doesn't need necessarily to be political activism. I have an opinion myself, but I'm usually not telling this opinion in my seminars. But I think I fight for democracy. I try to teach them what can be democracy, and this proves, there is an effect that I can see.
I think, especially thinking about this through the lens of Turkey, when you were saying that you're, looking across at Europe and North America, you haven't seen anything like Turkey. Turkey is such an outstanding case of activists really putting it on the line and becoming, academics really putting it on the line and becoming activists, that it's hard for other cases to really stand up. But I think it says something about I think in general, what's broadly a complacency within North America and European academia, and I say this, you know, as an American academic who's been in the UK for about 7 years, and I've also taught at other universities on the continent. If you look at strikes in the UK, we've had a lot of strikes of the union, but they don't do much. It's not like the miners' strikes in the 1970s or 80s where people really put it on the line. They were willing to sacrifice their jobs and lose money and not be able to pay rent and not know with their family, you know, what's going to happen to their family. And this is what academics in Turkey are doing, and this is not what academics in you know, Western Europe, North America are doing. There's been almost, I mean, you know, people are in precarious contracts, and there's almost the hope that it can be so precarious that you think, screw it. You know, who cares? I'm just going to go and take a risk at this point. But it's almost as though it's like putting a lobster in a slowly heating up pot of hot water where, you know, they don't do much, but then they're fried in the end. And that's what it feels like in UK higher ed at the moment, where it's become super neoliberalized. But I think also at the same time, just to add one quick last point, is that traditionally it hasn't been professional academics, but it's been students. And this is where the neoliberalization of higher education and the loading of students with huge amounts of student debt is great for depoliticizing them, very much unfortunately. And so I think that in cases where that isn't the case, I think there's a lot more hope for students to be able to have, you know, the skole, the leisure to not only just learn, but also be political during their student lives as well.
Well, I fear that time is pretty much up, but I'm so grateful for all these comments and for this discussion. And what it shows me also is that one of the things we do in academia too little is to talk across disciplines, and even in comparative politics, which is about comparisons, we do tend to focus on our own examples. Also out of fear, perhaps, you know, for trampling into somebody else's terrain or for not knowing enough about the other contexts. But I think, especially in this politically turbulent context, it is important for us to be exchanging these different positions and thinking through the specificities and parallels of these different cases. There was one last question that I didn't take up about the specificity of the US and the Constitution, but I think one thing we learned is that no constitution is good enough to just protect us all from illiberal tendencies. I mean, it does depend on the people, and it does depend on who fills these institutions with life. And so I think we can learn a lot, and we have to be careful not to be complacent in those northern contexts. I see Juliane back on the screen, and so I can just say thank you again to Deutsches Haus, thank you to Juliane, thank you to the panelists and the great questions, and please do buy our book, of course, but it's not crucial, but it gives some additional answers which we haven't been able to explore here.
Thank you so much, Boris, and thank you so much to all our wonderful panelists for this indeed very rich and facettenreiche, and as you just said, Boris, the wonderful transdisciplinary and trans-country approach that really was such an enrichment for us, for the audience. I haven't seen that quite as extensively done as on this panel, and I found that like a very convincing approach and worthwhile exploring. So thank you so much for all the great work you've done in your research and sharing your thoughts and observations with us. And I was just watching this wonderful video of Patti Smith singing with a large group of people at, I think, the New York Public Theater. She sang "The People Have the Power," and with people in chorus. And I just want to remind us of that, despite all the, you know, challenges we are facing and the populist tendencies, but we mustn't forget that power. And in that context, I want to share my mug with you, which you perhaps can't read. It's Great Expectations, and it's referring to the wonderful Dickens novel, but I want to take that as an omen for next week. So thank you. Bye-bye. Bye, everybody. Thank you so much.